All right, so let's think about the role of technology in terms of the organizational structure. So what role can technology have in terms of changing what the organizational structure is? So whether we're looking at work specialization, departmentalization, chain of command, span of control, centralization, formalization. Does technology play a role in determining what the organizational structure is? Maybe it's for good, maybe it's for bad. So what role can technology play? Well, one thing that technology can do is that we could have robots, machines, in part of the manufacturing or production process. So if we are having machines do some of the production, then that means the work specialization won't be as specialized for our workers, because the boring jobs where you're just turning the same screw can be done by a machine, in which case the individual is now overseeing multiple equipment. And then that means there is more tasks for the individual. The work specialization isn't as specialized or narrow. It also means that it can change the layout of our organization, because if we have mechanized production, then we don't necessarily need that product layout. And we're not necessarily grouping by our functional areas if we're still on the manufacturing operations process at lower level. So mechanization does allow for more of that cellular layout where we have automation. So we have individuals who are going to be looking over multiple parts of the task, multiple parts of the workflow. And so it allows for a hybrid between what you see that image B, that process layout, and D, that product layout. So technology can impact the layout, can impact the organizational structure. How else can technology impact the organizational structure? Well, we talked before about span of control. How many people are you managing? And that really comes down to how many people can the manager deal with in terms of questions, concerns, issues that arise where employees need the help of the manager, or the manager needs to keep an eye on the employees. Well, if we have technology that does more surveillance, measures productivity, reports on performance of our workers, then we can have a much wider span in terms of that span of control. So for example, you might have equipment like Microsoft Teams and Outlook Mail. Well, it reports and says, here's what percentage of emails you have responded to. Here's what percentage of your day is full of meetings. And so it's actually checking to see if you are doing your work and when you're doing your work. Well, if we have technology that is monitoring that information and provides it to the manager, then that's less individual surveillance that the manager has to do, and they can have a wider span. They can have more subordinates. So as we're looking at the role of technology, we can also look at an organizational structure that is more boundaryless. So technology allows us to change some of those organizational structures. So at GE, they have a boundaryless organization. So it's not being defined by a specific chain of command, and there's no limits on span of control. And they've replaced departments with more team-based structure. So the idea here is that if you are at GE and you're in the finance portion of the company, there's also appliances, there's also aviation. You can switch between and work on projects in different areas. There's really that flow. It's not as siloed. So when we talk about boundaries, we have vertical boundaries. Oh, let me just go out so I can write. We have vertical boundaries, and we have horizontal boundaries. Okay, so really what we're thinking about here is thinking back to our org chart, the traditional org chart. And vertical boundaries, okay, if we're separating vertically, so we're cutting here, This is separation by rank. And we have horizontal boundaries, which is separation by departments. Okay. In a mechanistic organization, you have vertical boundaries. So you are limited in terms of interacting with people of authority above you. One step, you don't necessarily talk to the people who are 2-3 steps ahead. So we think about the president of an organization. How often do they interact with the people on the operating floor, the people who are doing the production? So how often does Jeff Bezos interact with the people who are filling boxes at Amazon? So vertical boundaries is what we're looking at here, is separation by rank. Horizontal boundaries is separation by department. So GE would have horizontal boundaries if the people who are working in the finance area were not interacting with those who work in appliances. And so the term boundaryless organization comes from the CEO of GE, Jack Welch, talking about they've removed the vertical boundaries, so you can interact with people at higher levels in the organization, and they've removed the horizontal boundaries, so you can interact with people in other departments or subsidiaries. You can interact with people in aviation or appliances. And so there's this free flow in terms of allowing people to work on projects throughout the company in the multiple areas and to interact with people at higher levels. So technology allows for more of a boundaryless organization, because if we think about the environment where we have programs like Teams for virtual meetings and for text messaging the people in your organization, well, now with text messaging through Teams, you can message anybody in the organization. Everybody is together. So there's no longer that separation by rank, because you could send a message to the head of HR, you could send a message to the president. We also can look at can we use technology to make it boundaryless at the horizontal piece, so that siloing within the organization where people don't talk to others who are outside their functional area or outside of their product or outside of their project, can you more closely integrate and have more cross-functional teams, which removes that horizontal boundary. And so we're using technology information systems to share across departments, to share across parts of the organization, so that we have less separation. So how else can you have a boundaryless organization? Well, greater flexibility here in terms of work. So the traditional mechanistic organization, expects you to clock in from 9 to 5, but more boundaryless organizations have compressed workloads. You can work 4 days a week, you take Fridays off. Or maybe you have flex time. That is, all you have to do is get the work done. The company doesn't care how long it takes to do it or what time of day you do it. So if you work for CMHC, for example, Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, they don't care as long as you get the work done. So if it takes you 2 hours, it doesn't matter. You take the rest of the day off as long as the work gets done. You want to work at night versus during the day, that's up to you as well. So very flexible in that regard. Maybe your organization has a lot of contingent workers, so temporary or freelance or contract workers. And so we talked before about that network type organization model where you bring in people when you need it. So here we're reducing those boundaries within the organization. We also see boundaryless organizations have job sharing. So maybe you have 2 or more people split a full-time job. So again, we need that level of information sharing where we can have someone work part of the job and the other person pick up where they left off. Means that there has to be a good deal of information that is shared and collaborated. We can look at virtual organizations. So virtual organizations can have some of those 6 elements of organizational structure, but they're also going to rely on technology to get work done. So that might mean that telecommuting, that is living in the world of Teams or Zoom, where you're doing your video conferencing and working from home. It could be that your business runs in a virtual marketplace. So we look at Meta, for example, and you could sell your goods in that virtual marketplace. So you're basically selling electronic items to electronic people. And so your business solely lives in the world of technology. So you might have a virtual organization, in which case you're going to have some of those 6 elements of the organizational structure. And so again, you're still going to have to decide centralized, decentralized, what is your span of control? And so as you make these considerations, consider that remote environment. So what are the benefits to working remotely? What are the challenges to working remotely? Well, if you've done some virtual school in the last couple of years, or maybe you've worked virtually, the benefit, of course, is that below the screen, you're wearing your pajamas and you can crawl out of bed and just go right to work. You don't have to commute. And right now, gas, I think, is $1.56 a liter. So it definitely saves money on gas to work from home. There can be flexibility too, right? In terms of being able to look after sick kids and not have to take the day off to do so. What are the challenges to working remotely? Well, you feel kind of out of the loop. You don't know what's happening at work because unless someone intentionally lets you know, you're not there on the sidelines to just kind of observe it happening. So you get disconnected. And that can be a challenge for workers in terms of that loss of relationships. We talked in a previous video about how we have networks, 3 types of networks within the organization. Our friends, the people we get and share information with, and then of course the people that we share and get materials from. So when you work remotely, you lose some of that information and you lose the friendships as well. So it can be very isolating to work remotely. So as you're thinking about working remotely, what does the organizational structure look like for the remote organization? And this is not a new thing. There has been remote working for a long time. So if we go back to the Hudson Bay Company in 1670 or the East Indian Company, these companies had employees that were a continent away, and this was when there was no technology. So how do you do remote work back then when there's no tech? How do you make it work? Well, the key for the Hudson Bay Company was 2 things: trust and control. So the thing is you had to hire people that you could really trust, that you could leave alone and empower to do the work. So we really have that level of decentralization of the decision making. Because with the Hudson Bay Company, the only contact you would have with your employees might be 1 letter once a year. So you don't know what's happening most of the time. So in that case, there has to be a high level of trust. So you need to know the people you work for and work with, and you need to know that they have given you the authority to make decisions in that remote location, because there's no time to send the question back to headquarters to get them to give you the solution, right? It's going to take a whole year to find out the answer to your question. So a high level of empowerment, trust, and decentralization. Now, what happens if your employees are not doing what they're supposed to be doing? So I think after some drunken revelry, at the Hudson Bay Company, some of the employees burnt down one of the trading locations, one of the forts. So what do you do then? Well, there's trust, but then there's also control. So when headquarters finds out that there's been mischief or that work is not being done properly, then they come down, bring in the authorities, take control, and it's a very tight leash until the employees again prove that they can be trusted. So those two aspects meant they could maintain the remote work, but when issues arose, then you start to have a lot of manager presence watching the employees. Okay. So we can build an organizational structure that allows for remote work, and today we have technology that helps us do that. So an interesting article here from 1988, And this article here talks about how in 1988-89, we're looking at a period in which all you could really do with your computer is email. Like, that's about it. So this IT expert was looking at the myth of the electronic college. That is, people working remotely. And he said not many people are or will be in the position to work at home in the future because of space constraints, because of the nature of their occupation. Well, what we have found with COVID is that, just gotta find my information here, is that 27% of men worked from home and that 35% of women worked from home. So he's right. Today, we know not all jobs are conducive to working virtually. Harvard Business Review estimates that after COVID is long gone, 17% of the workforce will still work remotely. And we do see now, we see organizations actually willing to pay their workers to stay working from home because it reduces the cost of maintaining the building, right? The lights on. And then we see other organizations that want their workers back in the office. So the second point from this article, it says, of those who could work at home, not many will choose to do so because working from home suits only some people. So of course we talked about the challenge of being isolated, not having those interactions, and not knowing what's happening within the organization. He also says that we're unlikely to see a major increase in home working. Okay. But we will see some. We will see a small but steady increase, just not tons. And we'll see more of a hybrid version. And it turns out that his predictions in 1989 have been pretty spot on. As we said, Harvard Business Review says about 17% of workers will be remote long after COVID is gone. So we can then think of some pros and cons of remote work. We've already talked about some of them, right? So the time savings, not having to drive to work. Maybe you're more productive because there's less chats in the hallway. More flexibility, right? You can take a break. You can walk to the kitchen and grab lunch. And you can also work at the times that suit you and balance those family needs, as we talked about before, in terms of staying at home with the kids and still being able to get work done. Cost savings for the business in terms of not having to pay for office space. And as we said before, with like Teams and the text messaging, there's less organizational hierarchy. You can, if we're virtual, you have the contact information for people across the organization. The downside, of course, is less camaraderie. You don't have those interactions with people in the hallway. It makes it hard to collaborate. I'm sure if you've taken an online course, you know that group work takes much longer. We lose the informal interactions, as we said, and it's harder to develop relationships with other employees and also with customers. So as we look at our organizational structure and we look at that virtual world and remote working, we look at some of the businesses right now. So Elon Musk has told his employees at Tesla they all have to be back in the office. And the reason they have to be back in the office is because he likes to manage by walking around. Whereas the Hudson Bay used to manage by canoe, he manages by walking. Hudson Bay Company had to take canoes to all their different fur trade locations. So he manages by walking around. What does that mean? Well, in order to know what the employees are doing, know if the employees are working, know how well it's working, Elon Musk likes to walk around and observe people working. Well, in a virtual environment, you can't walk around and see what your employees are doing. You might have some technology that tells you when your employees are online doing responding to emails or in virtual meetings, but you can't see what they're doing. And so Elon Musk has said all of his Tesla employees must be back in the office. So as we look at the organizational structure, how much autonomy do your employees have? How much span and control do we have? Those are all, of course, going to be impacted if you're virtual versus face-to-face. There was an article that came out about remote working that said I could be dead for 2 weeks and my boss would never know. So the benefit, of course, of the virtual working is that you may have autonomy, employee empowerment, decentralization. So you are given your tasks and you go for it. On the other hand, the downside is that your boss can't see you doing it. That's the manage by walking around. And so you might be less likely to get promotions. When we think about our interactions with our bosses, some of it is performance theater. That is, we want to show that we're working hard. We want to show that we're doing things great. And so when they're walking around, when you see them down the hall, right, it kind of changes the way you behave and you do things so that you get noticed. The challenge with working remotely is it's hard to get noticed. Morgan Stanley CEO told his employees, make no mistake about it, we do our work inside the Morgan Stanley office. So you have to be back in the office. So as we're thinking about our organizational structure and whether it includes more remote work, we need to think about why some people want to be in the office and others don't. Those leaders who have said we have to be back in the office, that's James Gorman of Morgan Stanley, Elon Musk. Their primary concern is that there's loss, cross-team collaboration, and pollination. The idea being that if we're all just hanging out in the same place, we will bounce ideas off of each other. And while we're standing around the water cooler, we'll have some great epiphany for this new product, this new way to do things that involves people from different functional areas. And because if we're remote, we would never really interact with these people. There wouldn't be these great opportunities. Well, this does make an assumption that you have people at the water cooler interacting and that they are coming up with great ideas with each other, with people that aren't necessarily in their department, in their functional area, right? So who is most likely to do that? Who is most likely to be at the water cooler sharing ideas with people outside of their area? Well, these are people who feel psychologically safe at work. So what does that mean? You feel psychologically safe at work if you feel free to give and receive feedback, to raise your voice in concern. If you're willing to speak out and ask questions and you're not too worried about how people see you, how people react, you feel psychologically safe, that is, you are willing to express your ideas, you're the ones that want to be at the office, want to be at the water cooler, and benefit from it. But recognize that in your organization, everyone may not feel psychologically safe. They may not be willing to share the ideas, to raise concerns, to speak out. And so having everyone back face to face may not be the organizational structure that's most beneficial. If we look at a more remote environment, does that allow others to express and give feedback that they wouldn't do in the bigger group? Or how do we need to structure our organization in terms of making individuals feel like they can provide feedback? Does it need to be a smaller span of control so that there's less people with a manager so you can work more closely together and share that information? Does there need to be more decentralization to empower the employees so they can be the ones who fix the issues, who identify the issues? So things to consider as you look at your organizational structure. And of course, as we talk about what's the chain of command, how many people are under you, where are the decisions made, how specialized is the work, all of this is closely related in terms of whether your people are there face to face or whether they are in a virtual environment. If you are in a virtual environment, let's just go one last slide here. If you are working remotely, of course, some strategies for effective work, especially if it's going to be more gig type work, so contract based. So maybe you're part of that network organizational structure, you want to find a place that's protected from distractions. You want to have a routine, so a certain time, a certain place you do your work to reduce that uncertainty. People who are doing that remote work, contract work, need to have a purpose. So it's more than just about the money. Perhaps you are doing it so that you have more flexibility and can pursue your interests on the side. And you need to recognize that if you are doing that contract work and that remote work, then there is that potential for social isolation. So look at the balance between the predictability in terms of the job having reduced uncertainty. You know what to expect. If we're doing a full-time face-to-face job, we know the routine versus possibility. So if we're doing remote work or we are doing contract-based work, then that does allow more flexibility for you to pick what you're working on when you're working on it. And then we want to balance vitality and viability. So when we talk about viability, we're talking about the promise of continued work. So knowing that we always have a paycheck and something to do versus that viability. Do you feel present? Do you feel authentic? Do you feel alive? Is it engaging you? And so if you're considering work that is more virtual or that is more contract-based, so you're part of a network organizational structure, recognize that it's really got to be something that's more than just the money to make it viable to you so that you want to do it because you're really off on your own. And recognize that there's that relationship between the vitality, right? Is it steady flow of work? So things to consider as you think about the organizational structure you want to be a part of or the organizational structure that you are building for your company.